Hey, welcome back. And as always, I'm so glad that you're here. I want to start with a scenario today. Let's start with a scenario today. And I want you to kind of sit in it for a second before we add anything to it. Here's the context. Here's the situation. You're a leader, which you are probably. You walk into a meeting very prepared. Now, it could be your meeting. It could be a broader meeting with other leaders or peers of in your case. When I think about the scenario, when I was the lead pastor of Woodstock City Church, I walked into lots of meetings that were my meetings where I set the agenda. But because we were a campus location of North Point, I also was on the leadership team of North Point Ministries and walked into lots of meetings that were Andy Stanley's meetings. So whether it's your meeting or not, it doesn't matter. But let's just assume that you have something you need to share. So you walk in prepared. You have data, and the data is solid. The reasoning is really tight. You have done the work that no one else, by the way, in the room has really done. And you're not cocky, but you do know it, right? You know that you're more prepared. And you get to present all this information, and you do it really well. You present it very clearly. And what happens? The room pushes back. What do you do with that? Like, what do you do when you walk into a room prepared? And maybe you're the leader of that room. Maybe you're just a leader within that room. But there is something that you need to share that needs to move the needle in some way. There's something that needs to shift, needs to change. You name the thing, and you probably know what it is already. And so you've done your homework. You have worked hard. You are prepared, and you share all of this as well as anyone could share it, and the room doesn't budge. The room kind of pushes back against all the great work and all the information. What do you do with that? Most leaders that I work with really land on the same diagnosis when this happens. They think the problem is everyone is resistant. Or, maybe it's politics, global country, or maybe just inner team politics, right? Or a team that just won't commit to anything. There's all sorts of things that we come up with, diagnoses we come up with. And sometimes there's an element of truth to that. But I want to make the case today that the misdiagnosis of this problem is more common than the actual problem. And while leaders kind of get that wrong a lot, they do go back. Because when we get this wrong, our temptation is to go back with more data, right? With more certainty, with more preparation. But the pattern just keeps repeating. And the reason is that the issue was never the content anyway. And it was actually, and I know you prepared, but it was the delivery. Now, let's talk about this a little bit more. Here's the core thing I want you to hear today, right? Correctness is not the same as influence. Okay? Being right is not the same thing as having influence. These are not synonyms. They're not even close to that. There is a version of leadership, and I have seen it in high capacity, deeply gifted leaders and pastors that treats accuracy as leverage. I know people who think this is the same thing. Like, if you get the facts right, if you build the argument, you present it with confidence, and you assume the room is just going to follow because the logic demands it. I got to tell you, and you probably know this to some extent, it doesn't work that way. And it has never worked that way. Like, people do not process information in a vacuum. I mean, think about this. They filter anything that's being said through multiple lenses, through trust, through perception, through history, through whatever you communicated in the 30 seconds before you made your point. If any of those things are off or have an obstacle embedded in them, right, the information, no matter how right it is, doesn't land. And it doesn't matter how correct you are, how right you are. And that's kind of genuinely uncomfortable. It's hard to say that, right, to someone who has done all the hard work, who has investigated, studied, read the books, and is so prepared. Because the implication is that being right isn't enough. And for a lot of leaders, that does feel unfair. I'm a very logical thinker. And so I hate that this reality is true, but I got to tell you, I have learned this the hard way so many times. It is feel unfair. And to an extent, it is kind of unfair. But fairness isn't the issue here, right? Effectiveness is what we're trying to address. So I do want to be careful, right? Because It's easy for this to get misunderstood, right? This is not an argument for softening the truth, right? I'm not telling you to soften the logic or soften the realities of what you want to share, right? I'm not telling you to pad every hard conversation or the things that you're correct about to, craft it in such a way that you're kind of like padding it so much that you lay all this relational groundwork and you end up not really saying anything. I am not suggesting any of that, right? You don't need, anyone's approval before you lead. If you're called to lead, go lead. I mean, hard things need to be said, right? Clear decisions need to be made. So leaders who wait until everyone is comfortable are not actually leading anyone anywhere. But there is a difference between courage and carelessness. That's the issue here, right? We said that presentation is the problem, and that's where carelessness shows up. It's not often in what we want to say, it's how it's being said. So there is a difference between directness and just being tone deaf. And a true message still needs an effective messenger. I mean, think about this. If you preach at all, you know this is true. It doesn't matter how true the message is if the messenger is ineffective. And I think most of us would agree with that, at least in the abstract. The harder part, though, is applying it to yourself in specific situations or conversations or with a specific person, especially when you're convinced that you are right. Okay, it's easy to bring this kind of thinking to the stage, to the pulpit, right in front of your congregation, in front of your church. But what about in the meeting? What about with your peers, right? What about with your bosses, your direct reports, right? That's where this gets really real. So let me give you a framework that will help you. I want to give you a framework for thinking about what influence requires. Because I think a lot of leaders assume that influence is just a personality trait or it just exists, right? You either have it or you don't, right? That is not how influence works. I mean, you're either naturally likable or you're task oriented. I mean, that's true. Or you may be more visionary or not, but that is not what we're talking about. That's not influence. So, influence is a skill. Influence is a skill, and it is built on three things that every leader can develop. So, how do you gain influence? Here's how. Three things. One, it's through having self awareness, not just knowing what you're saying, but knowing how you are landing in the room. Okay, what energy are you bringing to this conversation? What does your posture signal? Are you leading or are you defending? Those things communicate before your first sentence. So, influence is gained through being self aware, self awareness. The second thing is pacing. Not every truth needs to be delivered at full speed in the same conversation. Think about this. Sometimes the most strategic thing you can do is not finish the entire idea or thought in that meeting. What would happen if you gave people space to move towards a conclusion instead of backing them into it? Pacing can help you gain influence. It's really critical, especially when you're trying to share something that can create large shifts or changes in the organization. And then here's the third one to gain influence. Third thing you got to do, it's about framing. Okay, the same decision presented in two different ways can produce two entirely different responses. And I don't suggest this to be manipulative at all, right? This is really about stewardship. I mean, you are stewarding a truth, and that truth matters. Of course, this is true on the platform if you're a preacher, but if you have done some real homework, you have data, you have a lot of great strategic thinking, you know with absolute doubt, right? And you've prayed through it, you know without a doubt what needs to happen. That's a truth. And that truth needs to be shared in a way that can move the room towards accepting it. That's a stewardship conversation, not a manipulation conversation. You are stewarding a truth, and that truth matters, right? So the question is whether you're framing, or whether the way that you frame this is helping people receive it, or is it just making it harder for them to receive it? So your framing matters. How you say what you say, that really matters. Now, that's an entire longer conversation. We'll have that at some point here in the future. But you know people who frame things well. Think about a preacher that you respect. How do they put together a piece of content to help a person hear something, receive something that isn't going to be easy to hear and easy to receive. How do they do that, right? Well, they do it by their framing, and it gains influence. Those are the three things: self-awareness, pacing, and framing. And those are not, I love this, those aren't soft skills, those are leadership skills. And they are the ones that most high capacity leaders at times underinvest in because they are so focused on making sure the content is right. So the stronger your instincts, right, the faster you're processing, the more confident you're going to be in your position. And the more likely you are to assume the room is just going to catch up with you and see it the way that you do. Hey, newsflash, that isn't how it works. Right? People move when they feel led, not just when they've been presented to, right? People move when they feel like they're being led to something, not when they are being forced on something. And listen, that is a distinction where a lot of leadership breakdowns happen. And it isn't even loud at times. It can be very quietly. It can happen over time. And you begin to lose influence over time. And I'll tell you what, the influence is like trust. It takes time to gain, but it is really easy to lose. So the leader in a room full of people who agree with him privately, but won't follow him publicly, that's where this leads if you are the point leader, right? So this isn't a team problem. This is actually an influence problem, and it creates problems for all of us, no matter where we are in the organization. So a leader who is, a leader who is usually right and rarely followed, they're actually not misunderstood. They're just ineffective at gaining influence. And that is a ceiling. And it creates a like real lid for you and your leadership in the organization. So let me just end with this. Let me give you kind of one leadership move you can make this week. I'd love for you to maybe pull up one conversation that you've had, and you can find something you have had in the last week or the last 30 days, whatever it was. Maybe it was a pitch that stalled, or a decision that took longer than you think it should have, or a moment where you kind of were prepared and the room still pushed back and you're struggling to understand why. I'd love for you to ask yourself one honest question. Did I lead with influence, or did I lead with correctness? Not whether you were right, because you probably were. The question is whether you were reading the room or just sitting in it. And then, if you can ask another question, ask this one. What would I have done differently with that specific person in that specific moment if I had just paid a little bit more attention to how it was landing? If I'd have thought more about influence than correctness? Like, you don't need to reconstruct the whole conversation, right? You just need probably to make one adjustment to carry the conversation forward. And before that next high stakes conversation, I'd love for you to spend a few minutes just thinking about this on delivery and not just the content. Like, ask yourself before you walk into that next room, what tone, does this moment actually require? How is this person likely to receive what I'm about to say? What is the first sentence that's going to open the door instead of kind of maybe locking it or closing it? So prepare the message, but also prepare as the messenger. And you know what's at stake if you don't do this, right? A truth that cannot travel doesn't transform anything. It just creates friction. I love that idea. A truth that can't travel, it doesn't matter how true it is. If it can't travel through the room, it's not going to transform or change anything or anybody. So the leader who keeps presenting correctly but landing ineffectively, you eventually kind of earn a reputation, and none of us want that, right? And believe me, I've had it. We don't want it. And we don't want, it's not what we're trying to achieve, right? This isn't about being bolder. You just are seen as difficult. You're not seen as a visionary. You're just seen as being more hard to follow. You can become the person that people agree with privately, but kind of work around publicly. I mean, that's a real leadership ceiling. And it doesn't matter how right you are on the other side of that, because influence is not optional when truth has to travel through the people. In leadership, it always has to travel through people. I mean, people are the point, and people are who and through we get results and outcomes. So the only real question is whether you are helping gain influence or if you're moving away from it. We'll talk to you next time.